I try not to use the word bitch. It's just like the N-word to me.
You know what I mean? Like, literally, when I was a teenager, it was just, I hope she wants to.
That's the nicest thing a guy could ever say to a girl, is finishing without control.
Baron is 18, he's handsome, he's tall, he's rich.
He's got the whole ball.
He's unleashed in New York City. Are you sure you want to reverse Roe v. Wade now?
I am embarrassed that I got so man-hating. I mean, there's a couple podcasts I did where I was like, fuck man, and that hurts people. I hurt people by saying that.
From a biological standpoint, women do need men, and I know they get mad when I say that, but a woman cannot take care of herself and her child on her own until recent times. But the problem is that...
But you agree that right now that they can.
Women deserve less.
Well, we live in a world nowadays where chivalry is punished, and I've always said, Dave Chappelle famously said chivalry's dead and women killed it.
I think that if a woman is an analogy to you, then you're not fucking ready to be talking to a woman.
When I was a little girl growing up, I desperately wanted to be liked by boys. One of my first memories is being 5 years old and putting on temporary tattoos to get the attention of this kid I liked in kindergarten. Growing up in elementary and middle school, I really internalized all of these storylines I saw on the Disney Channel and Nickelodeon that boys and girls just couldn't be friends. From Kim and Ron to Gordon and Lizzie to Raven and Eddie to Lily and Oliver to Sam and Freddie, it was everywhere. And it was in the music I listened to too. Just Friends by the Jonas Brothers and You Belong With Me by Taylor Swift were songs about being friend-zoned that I had on repeat. This was what was being fed to late-aughts preteens like myself. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I found myself in an abusive relationship with a senior who told me he was testing me, crafted these insane stories that he was going to die of a life-threatening illness by the time he turned 21, and isolated me from my friends. To break up with me, he sent me this song by Mika. Once I was free of him and was finishing up high school and getting ready to date for real in college, I remember asking my male friend at the time, the summer before we all went out into the world, why are girls and guys so different? How can I better understand men? What do guys really want at the end of the day? Because I was 18 and frustrated that I still didn't comprehend the opposite sex, but so desperately wanted to. He didn't really have much to say at the time. I mean, once my friends and I were at his house and he had porn open on his phone, like just casually. But one thing he did say stuck out to me, which was that guys don't realize when girls like them. You could literally be doing all you can to get a guy to notice you, but in fact, the more you ignore them, the more they'll take an interest in you. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But it was something I saw repeated in male-centered media like The Big Bang Theory, where Leonard and Sheldon don't realize women are hitting on them. But I always thought that was because they were nerds who didn't understand women, but I guess in reality, most men don't understand women and vice versa. And the more I grew up, when I entered my college years, the more I realized maybe that's by design. Creating a world in which the female population is taught that men and women can only come together to copulate and reproduce for the sexual pleasure of men serves men. A world in which men and women are brought up to believe that they have irreconcilable differences means that they can't be friends or allies, and if they are friends, the man must be gay or in a friend zone, and the woman who doesn't put out with their guy friends is selfish. This type of normalized patriarchal thinking that men are from Mars and women are from Venus helps to keep us from empathizing with each other and finding solidarity, and maintains us in separate gender boxes and operating on different planes of existence. There's the dominant plane, where men are continually privileged when it comes to political power, what stories get told, where money is concentrated, and then the oppressed plane, where women are supporting characters who complain too much, are too vain, and have too many feelings.
That a woman is like an egg salad sandwich on a warm Texas day, full of eggs and only appealing for a short time.
When I got to college, I realized that men and women in the end aren't actually fundamentally different. We're all complex individuals apart from our biological sex and gender expression. This isn't to say that there aren't biological and physical differences between the two sexes that impact the way we see the world, however. For example, it has been studied that male and female skulls are different as well as their brains. According to the non-profit Northwestern Medicine, in males, the inferior parietal lobule is significantly more voluminous in the left hemisphere compared to the the right. This extreme asymmetry is not present in females, and this may contribute to cognitive differences between the sexes. Additionally, there's evidence that women have more gray matter in their brains. Gray matter contains cell bodies that help our bodies process information in the brain and is located within regions of the brain that are involved with muscle control and sensory perception. Gray matter decreases during pregnancy, which helps explain pregnancy brain. That said, women have been found to use more white matter, which connects processing centers, while men use more gray matter. This could explain why men tend to excel at task-focused jobs, while women are more likely to excel at language and multitasking. So there are factors that distinguish one from the other. But the idea of two sexes is not only oversimplistic and erases intersex people, but also under patriarchy, this notion that men and women are just totally opposite from one another helps to explain away misogyny. Men's brains are just bigger is an easy fact to point to, even though it has no bearing on intelligence. Men just think with their penises. That's just how they are. They can't help themselves. Lets men get away with sexual assault, and also hurts men who are deemed impossible to assault because men want sex all the time, right? Conversely, you have shows like that 70s show that tried to spin the narrative that women like sex just as much as men do. They're just as sex crazed. And though somewhat progressive in that yes, women do enjoy sex as well, and they should be allowed to talk about it, also works to enforce this idea that men's behavior of objectifying women isn't wrong because girls like it actually. They just can't tell you, it's a big secret.
Donna, sex is how we control men. If they ever find out we wanted to, we'll never get jewelry again.
Lastly, to continue to enforce this idea that scientifically men and women are just utterly different helps to uplift the patriarchy in that there's no point in changing how the world works. Male dominance is just the normal order of things and also ignores the social aspect of how we're raised differently as girls and boys. Why do boys freak out when girls talk to them and vice versa? Is it because they're just wired that way, or is it because the two are brought up completely separate from each other, with girl toys and clothes on one side of the aisle and boy stuff on the other? A world where boys are raised to not cry, not show emotions, and not to act like a girl. A world where girls are excluded from sports and mocked for their interests, while also being ashamed about their bodies through school dress codes and diet culture. And though sex and gender are social constructs that we assign arbitrary meaning to, it obviously doesn't mean that they bear no weight on our everyday lived experiences and have no impact on our behavior, because they do. Women and men are treated differently in society based on these constructs. So much so that in the past century, the gender divide between men and women has only grown deeper, thanks to political radicalization, with men generally becoming more conservative and women on the whole becoming more progressive in a post-Me Too and post-2016 election world, and where the word incel has become mainstream. And though I started this video with my own personal anecdotes as a cishet woman growing up in and internalizing the patriarchy, it's clear to me from the gendered media that spawned during my adolescence to today, either as a byproduct of gendered socialization or as a way to enforce it, that I wasn't alone in my feelings of frustration at not understanding the opposite sex. From Sex and the City in the late 1990s to Guy and Girl Code from the early and mid-2010s, to today's podcast where men and women try to understand dating and the other's minds, to viral TikTok videos on how to be a woman or how to be a man, and the growing political ideological split between men and women, understanding the gender divide as it exists today with social media has never been more pertinent, especially as the older model for gendered media that simply opened the door to allow for conversations about taboo topics when it comes to heterosexual relationships has presently transformed itself into content that outwardly wants to own women in gender debates held by podcast bros and relationship gurus, and even women spouting traditional values. Most of the media today about the gender war, specifically media made by conservative men, and like I said, there's some conservative women in there too, is not so much that men don't get women as it is men want to destroy women for just talking about their lives and relationships. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to me as a woman who's now reaching 30 that many men in my life and throughout the world just see women as disposable, inherently less capable, irrational, less intelligent, and thus should be given less rights than men. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the normalization and later the radicalization of the gender wars in popular media, and why this whole shift in speaking about the gender wars occurred. We'll also talk about how men are coping with feminism Essentialism and the growing 4B movement, which is denying men sex, dating, kids, and marriage. And finally, we'll get into if women are going too far, if misandry exists, and how the gender war wasn't created equally. And before we start, I want to say that this video is primarily from my perspective as a cis-het woman, and thus primarily talks about cis-het men and women and the relationship between these two particular groups. But it's important to note that not everyone fits into these strict binaries. Gender is fluid and so is sex, and that not everyone identifies with the gender they're born with, and thus someone's sex might not align with the gender they present as. And like I said, many people are intersex and don't fit into these strict definitions of XX means female and XY means male. And one more thing to note is that when I talk about these two groups of cishet men and women, note that I'm always speaking generally. Everyone is different, no group is a monolith. So I'm going to say most of and some of as much as I can while I present the research I've done. So just know that I know not everything I say applies to everyone. So without further ado, let's go. So what is the gender war? Well, in the US, it refers to the split between cishet men and women and their irreconcilable differences. How men and women just can't get along, they never have and never will. They're fundamentally different, it's a fact of life, and yet knowing this, they're still expected to fall in love and create a family. In reality, these irreconcilable differences are fueled by the hegemonic patriarchy, or the normalization of a male-dominated society, where men and women and sex and gender itself is unchanging, and there's nothing you can do about it because to challenge patriarchy and gender roles is to go against biology and nature, when in reality, challenging patriarchy means finally dismantling a system that severely disadvantages women to keep them at the mercy of men. And the knowledge that men are the dominant sex at the expense of women means relationships between the two have always been uneasy to say the least, whether they be romantic relationships, professional, platonic, or otherwise, as men historically controlled, the US at least, politically, financially, industrially, and have purposely downplayed women's accomplishments in society and kept women out of corporate offices and government positions to maintain their own control. It's only up until the past century that women have gained somewhat equal footing to men. For example, it wasn't until 1974 that women could even have credit cards in their own name, helping women become financially independent from men and helping them not to need to get married. It's no wonder that women born in the 1970s from that era looked up to the likes of Carrie Bradshaw and her friends, who were exercising their financial freedom for the first time as adults in the late 1990s, since even their mothers weren't allowed that liberty growing up. However, though gains have been made in the financial sector and with more and more young women going to college and even becoming more politically progressive than men their age, women who are friends with men might feel like they should take an interest in them romantically, or feel pressure to do so, or risk violence. Women in the workforce might feel like they're being talked down to by their male co-workers, or even worse, sexually harassed at work, and then coerced into not saying anything to not lose their job. According to the Center of American Progress, the Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, said in the fiscal year of 2017, just less than 1/5, 16.5% of the sexual harassment charges received by the agency were filed by men, with the remaining 83.5% of the charges filed by women. And the National Library of Medicine stated in 2022 that there's also a vast number of underreported cases where victims of all genders feel like they can't speak out, or that no one will listen to them if they do. Specifically for minimum wage workers in front-facing service jobs, tolerating sexual harassment has become a condition of employment for many service sector staff and is often regarded as necessary to earn tips, rendering them powerless to report it if they want to continue working in the industry. Generally, the EEOC's unpublished data show that in every industry, women have higher rates of reporting sexual harassment than men. This result is consistent with other studies concluding that sexual harassment remains a problem that overwhelmingly confronts women throughout the entire workforce. And this isn't surprising considering how new women are to the workforce, and how long men have dominated those spaces, and how we live in a deeply sexist and gendered world where there's this ever-present narrative that the two genders are just inexplicably different. The normalization of the gender war reduces the impact that patriarchy has on women and men. It makes women believe that men are just assholes because that's in their nature and they can't do anything about it. Men can't do housework, take care of kids, or run errands because they just don't know how. That's woman stuff. They're born knowing to do all that, right? It's weaponized incompetence. Conversely, this idea that women and men are fundamentally different makes men think that women are illogical and irrational because that's just how women are. It even makes some women internalize these messages that they can't change their lot in life and that their lives are ruled by something that's out of their control. On the other hand, some women actually like their position as subservient to men, either because they don't see it as such, it's just a different role than men's, or because they actually believe in patriarchy, which is its whole other thing that I already made a video about. For feminists, the fight against a male-dominated society is made illegitimate by the gender binary and by gender essentialism, and the two-sided gender war because it means both sides are at fault. Men don't understand women, but also women don't understand men, and that's just as big of a problem as systemic and institutionalized misogyny, didn't you know? And though biological differences may explain how men and women may think and react differently in the world, it doesn't help that men get to operate under patriarchy and thus are conditioned to see women, even their own wives, girlfriends, and daughters, as disposable. In 2009, an infamous study came out by the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center that said a woman is 6 times more likely to be separated or divorced soon after a diagnosis of cancer or multiple sclerosis than if a man in the relationship is the patient, according to a study that examined the role gender played in so-called partner abandonment. And sure, maybe biology plays a role in this, but I don't think that's the only reason why this happens. The way a patriarchal society is set up is that men are given more freedom than women, financially, politically, sexually, and are given more excuses for their behavior, so they never have to be held accountable. Whereas a father can easily walk away from their family and kids and just disappear, and many start whole new lives and families, women who are pushed out of the workforce once they get pregnant and raise children become dependent on the man they partnered with until they can get back out there. Not to mention, women are raised to be nurturers because it's in their biology, so they feel more pressure to stay home and are the default caretakers of not just their children, but of their husband. There's this trend on Instagram called being a married single mother for a reason. And if we follow this biology argument to its final conclusion, we get men who can do whatever they want because they just can't control themselves, and women who have to follow their biological duty of child rearing and caregiving even when the men are being assholes to them. Hiding behind this oversimplistic view of the differences between men and women only helps men. Feminism thus becomes an affront to men, instead of being seen as a movement created to fight back against an already established system. For example, phrases like "not all men" and "what about men" get thrown around when highlighting violence against women done by men, and how normalized it is under patriarchy, in order to recenter the conversation around them and to help diminish women's very real concerns. Many men use these whataboutisms to even out the playing field, so they can ignore systemic issues like gendered violence. Words like misandry are also brought up to try to legitimize men's supposed struggle against women when women do not have the same amount of power as men do in society. There's a clear hierarchy, but a lot of men refuse to acknowledge that the gender war is unequal because it would mean that they have nothing to rail against. In addition, since we lived in the gender wars for so long, it creates this false view of the world where we're living in this post-patriarchal reality, a world where both sides should be able to air their grievances and be heard equally, when no, we're still living through it. For men, most men at least, they live in that post-world because there they don't have to be held accountable for being a man and benefiting from centuries of patriarchy. They can just make women cry and not feel anything about it because women are too sensitive, right? Anything for the views. Chivalry is dead and women killed it when feminism came along. When in reality, you should just be a nice guy to women because they're people too, not because you're trying to get something out of it, and also respect women's boundaries and be able to do chivalrous things by reading the room. Women want to be treated nicely and be respected, who would have guessed? But many men say that they don't want to be nice anymore to discredit feminism and show how women's rights have gone too far. Men may complain that they can't even hold the door open for a woman without being called a sexist, but also gleefully rejoice in the fact that they can now punch a woman in the face since we're all equal now, thanks to feminism. "I'm going to treat you like a dude now" is a lot of men's reactions to women wanting equal treatment, because a lot of men for some reason can't be normal in response to women being in control of when they want male attention. And I'm just gonna say it right here, it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong in these debates. Men who host podcasts like these are insufferable. They're trying to make a case for men's rights and how women are too picky and vain and materialistic, yet here they are demeaning them and thinking putting them in their place is going to make them look better in comparison. In their minds, they're just talking logically and calling out female hypocrisy, and they think that makes them look better than these overly emotional women dressed in revealing clothing crying hysterically on their channel. But it comes off to an outsider, or at least to me, as them just bullying women and trying to own them because they have nothing better to do. One of these people in particular comes off as really mean and rude and disrespectful, like good luck finding a partner. And sure, some men, I think most men, might even concede that they can be selfish too and not listen to the women in their lives and even weaponize their incompetence and could do better. But because of the normalization of gender essentialism, they're able to chalk it up to, I'm just a guy, that's just how guys are, or say that women have their faults too, you know. Don't you know how high her body count is? And it turns the whole fight for women's rights into a blame game, a he said, she said argument, and dismisses any idea of this being about a systemic struggle. And gender war media during the early 2010s, after Obama's re-election, when the population in the US was feeling pretty good about itself as most thought we were in a post-racist and post-sexist world, reflected this idea that men and women both had their problems, but they had nothing to do with patriarchal institutions. We don't need feminism. What we need is to just open the conversation and get to know one another to better understand where the other is coming from. And though that sounds good on paper, that doesn't reflect reality. And shows like MTV2's Guy Code, which aired in 2011, and later Girl Code and Guy Court, which both aired in 2013, Girl Court never became a thing, did just that. The shows hinge on the idea of a gender war and men and women being fundamentally different and separate, but also, at least at the time and even looking back, felt kind of progressive, especially when compared to how the gender divide is covered online today. Each show had male and female comedians as well as celebrities come in and talk about various taboo topics like porn and masturbation and dating and friendship, and each group was able to bring their own perspective to the table. Surprisingly, the cast of characters on each show seemed to be pretty diverse, with Asian and Black Americans and Latin Americans being able to have their time in the spotlight. It was one of Awkwafina's first gigs after she went viral with My Badge, and other comedians such as Nina Bayer and Nessa were on the show, and it was cool to see how they also had men and women with more out there gender expressions, and the women weren't just thin, white, feminine presenting women either. It was a very diverse panel, which I think was important. They even had men talking about how racist and sexist things were back then to women, even though it was done in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way.
She barely noticed your racist statement though, because she's too busy wondering why you still haven't taken off your frickin' white gloves. Are you the hillside strangler? Are you worried about leaving your fingerprints around? So guys, when your girlfriend asks you to be more like a gentleman from the good old days, you just remind her that those dudes were racist, sexist, and borderline psychotic. Just hold the door open for her and call it a day.
When it came to the word bitch, Charlemagne the God said that he doesn't like saying that, and other men acknowledged that it's not the best thing to say, to a woman at least. The men also talked about porn being unrealistic and to not look at it as the norm when it comes to sex.
Realistic expectations of sex for guys. First of all, 90% of the way guys finish, no girl is cool with.
And you can see that the beginnings of the mainstream feminist movement were definitely there. I mean, Awkwafina became famous for My Badge, talking about how cool her vagina was, but also in the bit about the word bitch. Many female comedians brought up the fact that it wasn't a progressive thing to say, even though they say it too.
I call my friends bitch. At the same time, after I do it, I'm like, I should stop doing this. This is not good. This is not helping women progress as a group.
Probably like my mom would be like, oh, did you hear they said the B word? And I'm like, Mom, that's a good thing. You're a badass old bitch.
The needle at the time when it came to gender politics was definitely progressive leaning and self-aware. The normalization of hating women and being pro-traditionalist and conservative wasn't as prominent in the mainstream as it is today. In turn, the men weren't as outwardly misogynistic, and the women weren't as outspoken when it came to feminism. The word feminist in the mainstream still had negative connotations in the early 2010s due to this idea that we were past all that misogyny stuff. Women are equal to men and should stop complaining. Though feminism was still a movement that existed at the time, especially online with sites like Jezebel, Feminicide, and Feministing, along with Anita Sarkeesian's series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which debuted in 2013, feminism wasn't as embraced by women in the mainstream as openly as it is today, due to again this idea that we don't need feminism anymore and anyone who identifies as a feminist is a dirty and hairy man-hating lesbian. I even remember being in high school and having mutual friends identify as misandrist, but I was afraid to even call myself a feminist, until I watched Anita Sarkeesian's video series in my freshman year of college and took a shit ton of gender studies classes in college. MTV, not MTV2, would later be more outwardly feminist towards the middle of the decade, in that in 2014 they platformed feminist blogger and educator Lacey Green by giving her a series on their YouTube channel called Brawless, and later Francesca Ramsey would host Decoded on MTV's YouTube channel, which talked about the intersection of race and feminism. But at the time, Sarkeesian Green Sarkeesian and Ramsey, as well as many others who were left-leaning YouTubers, were panned in the comments, and the like-to-dislike ratio was abysmal. Ramsey and Sarkeesian in particular were harassed to no end, sent death threats and hate mail, and feared for their own safety. Many men across the country, and MTV's viewer base specifically, were not having it. Why, you may ask? Because these creators challenged the already established status quo of the gender war, in that they were saying, no, this isn't a both sides issue. There's a power dynamic at play that's ingrained in institutions across the country that need to be addressed, and men are the main perpetrators and beneficiaries of those systems. The gender war isn't so much of a war as it is a crusade against women, as well as racial minorities, gender nonconforming folks, trans people, and the wider LGBTQ+ community. So though girl code did enter the mid-2010s as being kind of feminist, especially after Beyonce embraced the term in 2014 at the MTV VMAs, it really wasn't until post-2015 and Trump and Clinton's run for president that mainstream feminist discourse and talking points became embraced by progressive women everywhere. Liberal women really took the lead with this because Hillary Clinton was running against Trump, so the whole girl boss thing was really taking shape between 2015 and 2016. Plus, through liberalism, feminism could be turned into something more friendly, less alienating to women on the fence, and generally more pro-capitalist.
Yeah, I still believe. And all those things I didn't say, wrecking balls inside my brain. I will scream them loud tonight. Can't you hear my voice this time? This is our fight song. Take back my life song. Prove we're already so.
And though many women during this time of political polarization moved left, more and more men started to move right. So much so that there is now a clear divide ideologically between men and women, with most men being conservative and most women identifying with progressive politics. In the US, Gallup poll data shows that after decades where the sexes were each spread roughly equally across liberal and conservative worldviews, women aged 18 to 30 are now 30 percentage points more liberal than their male contemporaries. Germany also now shows a 30-point gap between increasingly conservative young men and progressive female contemporaries, and in the UK the gap is 25 points. In Poland last year, almost half of the men aged 18 to 21 backed the hard-right Confederation Party, compared to a sixth of young women of the same age. In South Korea, there is now a yawning chasm between young men and women, and it's similar in China. In the US, 19% of Gen Z teens who identify as male said they have more conservative views than their parents, whereas 14% of Gen Z teens who identify as female say they have more conservative views than their parents. So a 5% difference. And just 7% of Gen Z teens who identify as other said they have more conservative views than their parents. According to The Guardian, young women are the most progressive group in American history. Young men are checked out. Women did indeed show up to support Kamala Harris, but in smaller numbers than her Democratic predecessors. While Clinton won women by 13 points in 2016 and Joe Biden by 15 in 2020, Harris secured them by just 10 points, CNN found. Meaning even women are trending more conservative than they used to. When it comes to white women, although women as a whole have historically voted for Democrats, white women have not. Instead, over the last 72 years, a plurality of white women have voted for the Democratic candidate only twice, in 64 and 96. On Tuesday, they once again went for Trump, just as they did in 2016 and 2020, but Harris made inroads with them. She lost them by only 5 points, showing how women, even white women, are moving slightly left. More surprisingly, CNN reports Trump's lead among white men shrank from 23 points in 2020 to 20 in 2024, so there's a silver lining. Girl code and guy code would end in 2015, though girl code continued on Snapchat from 2017 until 2018. And honestly, I'm glad it ended when it did, because by 2015 things were already getting too divided when it came to women's rights, and the respect that most men had for women, at least to me, was going straight down the toilet. The conversations that we had on guy and girl code probably could never happen the same way again because of this increase of angry men radicalized to oppose feminism and therefore women's rights and women's perspectives. The needle shift from coded misogynistic language in the early 2010s to outwardly bigoted language towards the middle and end of the decade happened in a blink of an eye. That needle pointing left wasn't that strong to begin with, but in 2016, we really saw how fragile it all was. The rise in conservative politics and the normalization of the hatred of women and feminism feminism, I believe, was helped by the popularity of the internet and internet personalities that didn't need to rely on MTV to get their voices out there and find an audience. By 2015, YouTube was more popular than ever, especially with young people, as well as had an updated algorithm. In 2016, YouTube released a white paper describing some of their inner workings of its AI deep neural networks or YouTube recommendations. In short, the algorithm had gotten way more personal. The goal was to find the video each particular viewer wants to watch, not just a video that lots of other people have perhaps watched in the past. As a result, in 2018, YouTube's chief product officer mentioned on a panel that 70% of watch time on YouTube is spent watching videos the algorithm recommends. The algorithm helped push people down rabbit holes and created new norms for those very angry, disenfranchised men who already felt lonely and were predisposed to feel antagonistic towards women who, to them, were denying their God-given right to sex because of their newly found interest in feminism. Feminism and women are the reason you're unhappy, not the fact that men are raised to be as equally disposable to the state as women, are forced into a strict, unfeeling gender box, and made to feel inferior if they can't live up to this idea of manhood. Though it's natural for a progressive movement like feminism to face backlash and radicalize some people against it, as feminism has always faced misogynistic pushback, I do think the way in which men have been enabled and emboldened to spout misogynistic talking points and humiliate women without consequences is unprecedented. The conservative response to more progressive politics like feminism from the right isn't, let's talk about it, I want to hear your point of view, let's reach across the aisle, or even, in this gender war, there's two sides, which is what the entire debate used to be predicated on. Instead, nowadays the response to women wanting equal rights is, how can we mock you for views, how can we own you in a debate, and how can we make you out to be a hypocrite for money? Because men, like the people who host Fresh and Fit and Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan and all of these other horrible people, already think they're right, and their livelihood depends on that. So they will never concede even when they're wrong. There is no more gender war debate. And this increase in the political radicalization of men against women wasn't just a natural consequence of men genuinely responding to liberal and leftist ideas, but was helped along by algorithms, like we discussed, and online forums that helped give groups anonymity and real-time communication with individuals just waiting to radicalize them. Hate groups have moved online, and in turn, you have forums hell-bent on destroying people like Anita Sarkeesian, groups of incels and red-pilled users who both hate women and themselves, and you have groups like MAGTOW who swear off women, and on top of it all, you have Donald Trump. And yes, I do blame Donald Trump for legitimizing outward hate and disdain for women and changing the political landscape and pushing the entire country right, as even the Democratic Party has continued to move with him towards the center rather than against him. Trump has no problem with saying the quiet part out loud, which then enabled thousands, if not millions of men to do the same. From swearing in Brett Kavanaugh, a known rapist, from getting away with locker room talk, from not facing charges for his own rape allegations, it's just baffling that millions of men could be like, finally, someone who speaks my language. But when you think about it, it's honestly surprising with the amount of people who voted for Trump that we were able to keep up that facade of decency for so long. That we were able to have guy and girl code and not have it devolve into something like Fresh and Fit. And I guess part of what kept that stasis for so long was this idea that we had already reached progress, that we didn't need feminism, that the gender wars was just a fact of life that couldn't be tampered with. But honestly, that facade wasn't any better considering many men and even some women on guy and girl code turned out to be pro-Trumpers. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised considering I made a video about the liberal comedian to conservative pipeline, but here I am, still confused. So comedian Andrew Schulz from Guy Code, as well as his colleague Akash Singh, turned into Trumpers who use words like perpetual victimhood and victim mentality. Oh, that's rich. They currently are podcasters / video channel hosts with over 2 million subs. Comedian Chris DiStefano is friends with known sack of garbage Bill Maher and was just on an interview with him in February of 2024. Vinny Guadagnino, who was on Guy Code as he was on Jersey Shore, which was hosted by MTV, is pro-Trump and went to his MSG rally, not surprising. Annie Letterman, a comedian from Girl Code, was on the Joe Rogan podcast and talked about how after the 2016 election when Trump won, she felt triggered. She talked about how it brought up a lot of bad memories from her own past with assault, but then was like talking about how embarrassed she was about being a feminist at one point and about how man-hatey she became and how happy she is to be out of the feminist pipeline. line. And Jeff Dye, a Guy and Girl Code cast member, voted for Trump twice. But there are other members who are openly anti-Trump, like Charlemagne the God, Nicole Byer, Joe Budden, Melanie Iglesias, and Pete Davidson. And though I might have liked that false sense of security before we saw how polarized the US population was, when we could just hide behind this gender war as being a fact of life, I'd much rather know that you're a bigot than trying to guess if you are. And I'd much rather have the word feminist and feminism be popular and known and embraced than something to be ashamed of. And before I end this section, I want to say that a positive takeaway I got from Guy and Girl Code was that though it relied on gender stereotypes and a lot of the comedians on the show are now pro-Trump, it did at least try to break down the mystique and confusion that surrounds the opposite sex. We saw the cast as just regular people from all walks of life. It was humanizing in a way, which I think is important, especially for women, and I think it also helped women better understand men, as men have their own hardships too under patriarchy. I don't want to downplay that, of course. I know this video may come off as women are angels and saints and men are the devil, but that's not what I'm trying to say here. Rather, what I am trying to get across is that cishet men as a group occupy a privileged position in society that they did not choose, and yet reap the rewards and benefits anyway. Especially wealthy white cishet men, and how their privilege comes at the cost of women as a group, but especially non-white women, black women and brown women specifically, and that's not right. But also, women can be equally as bigoted and horrible and misogynistic to other women, and have touted racist and homophobic and transphobic beliefs, as well as traditionalist beliefs, not because they're brainwashed and stupid, but because they actually believe in these ideas. Women as well as men are capable human beings and are aware of the choices they make. To conclude, women and men have a hard time understanding one another. That is true. But it's not because of this imagined gender war or biology, but rather because of patriarchy and how it keeps the two sexes separate and allows one to be superior to the other. The other sex, particularly women, but men too, thus become mysteries to be solved rather than fellow human beings. And under capitalism, we're already alienated from one another and are raised to see the other as disposable. But with patriarchy, it makes it even harder for women to be taken seriously and be seen and heard. And that is something that needs to be addressed and changed. So in the previous section, I delved into a little bit about how men, specifically reactionary men, have responded and coped with feminism, at least online, mainly through hosting pro-male podcasts, where they gripe on and on about how feminism is killing modern women and men, and how useless and pointless it is, how it's a brain-dead ideology, and that women who adhere to feminism are hypocrites. They make money off of making women cry and humiliating them for views and to show off how smart they are. And though a lot of men find this content to be cathartic, a lot of women don't fall for this BS. I mean, the if a woman is an analogy to you, you're not ready to be with a woman, lives in my head rent-free. And I know that she didn't understand the analogy correctly, but she's still right. Though there are many women who are conservative and spout traditionalist views, particularly white women who lean right, there are plenty of women of all races who see right through this demeaning rhetoric and roll their eyes. For all the men who comment in my videos cope, it's the men who are doing the real coping. Like, do you really think women will like you the way you are right now? Other ways men on the right have coped with feminism is by belittling abuse victims, hating on Amber Heard, for example, and specifically working to discredit her in viral TikToks because she has to be lying, right? Other men who voted for Trump are even giving up on finding American girlfriends and instead are looking elsewhere. I even met an American man in Brazil a week after the election who voted for Trump but wants to find a woman outside of the US to partner. But I guess that shouldn't be surprising considering Trump himself is the poster child for just that, even though Trump hates immigrants. And women are the hypocrites. Some right-wing men go after women who wholly have to depend on them. And in their minds, women from the global south or from former Soviet nations who have their legality in the US tied to their male partner is exactly what these men want, so they can be in total control. This isn't to say that women who partner these men are stupid, quite the contrary, but that the power dynamic between the two is one that has the potential to be extremely abusive. And that's by design. Abusers choose their victims, and since American women have become too liberated and thus are too shallow and demanding, why not go for a woman outside of the US who, to these men's minds, will be more traditional? In the TLC reality show 90 Day Fiancé, they always try to twist this kind of plot into, oh, the woman is just looking for a green card and doesn't really love this guy. But in reality, a lot of the time, it's the American man who's looking for someone to be their obedient and submissive pet, but no one seems to question his intentions, at least most of the time. And again, the women almost always see through this facade. Again, if you look at 90 Day Fiancé, a lot of women end up leaving these kind of guys. But a lot of women who are brought into the country on false pretenses or due to their partner's ignorance about their own culture and thinking that they will be submissive don't have the ability to leave. As the International Affairs Review author Tyler Ackerman writes, one notable case is the murder of Susanna Blackwell, a pregnant Filipina bride in Washington state. In 1995, her husband shot Susanna and her 2 friends in court because she was filing for divorce. She was officially married for only 2 weeks before her husband first assaulted her. While she ceased living with him, she was unable to legally obtain a divorce. Susanna was trapped because of a 2-year conditional permit that all immigrant spouses must comply with. This permit proclaims that immigrants who come to the U.S. for marriage must remain with their spouses or risk losing residency, specifically if it appears the marriage was only for the purpose of maintaining their legal status. Out of fear of deportation, victims often acquiesce to their husband's desires, especially regarding unwanted sex acts, not unlike involuntary servitude. According to the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking Persons, women and girls account for 71% of all trafficked victims detected globally. Additionally, females represent 96% of victims trafficked for sexual exploitation. But I will say that it's important to note that not all of these types of relationships are abusive, and that there's also some women who marry foreign men to only later be abusive and horrible to them. While women still represent the majority of trafficking victims, the proportion of identified male victims have increased from 16% in 2004 to 29% in 2014, according to the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking Persons. In the end, what I'm trying to highlight is the fact that conservative and traditionalist men oftentimes go looking for love overseas, thinking that they'll find their obedient, docile wife in a supposed third world country because of their own ignorance and disrespect for women in those nations. It's their so-called solution to American feminism and liberal and progressive women. Men do this without realizing that women in these nations that they see as less than are just as capable and smart and progressive than women elsewhere. Other men have been pushed down the alt-right pipeline or are currently going down it online. Men who may be centrist but lean conservative as it suits them better as white cishet men are able to cope with the changing world around them and the advancement of women's roles in society via Instagram and the For You page and YouTube Shorts and their algorithm as they work to reinforce the user's own cultural norms such as white supremacy and male dominance. It starts with just making fun of Biden and then turns into how beautiful Gal Gadot is compared to Zendaya and Rachel Zegler. Then it transforms into how cool Trump is in comparison to the Dems, and it just gets deeper from there. I have met men in my life who are shown content about how ugly Zendaya is on a daily basis, and to me, there's no way that isn't racially coded. I guess what I'm surprised by is how different someone's feed can be compared to my own, especially if they're a man. Whereas I get nothing but Zendaya and Tom Holland's cute moments, conservative-leaning men get Zendaya compared to a McDonald's employee, with captions like, "Who's hotter?" It's so obviously and painfully, again, racist and sexist, but the men who like these posts claim that they're not. They're just dodgy enough to not be on good-meaning men's radars. One is just objectively more beautiful, that's all. But that's how radicalization starts, by infiltration, and then creating a new norm, and then seeing how far a user can be pushed and making sure they're always comfortable. And then soon you're being shown videos about how this OnlyFans mom is sad that she can't support her kids, but it's her fault after all. Why doesn't she get a real job? When I think of radicalization, I'm always reminded of this spectrum of violence that men participate in. We as women would like to think that most of the men in our lives are good men and would never see us as less than or treat us that way, but guess what? A lot of men do and think just that. During the election, there was a viral moment for women, mostly white women, who talked about how they lost their father to Trump and how Waltz reminded them of their dads before they went down the pipeline and before that needle shift.
And seeing Tim Walz, seeing that he was an educated conservative that saw the party getting weird and changed his mind. He has empathy. He represents all of those qualities that were stripped away from my normal father by this cult. And it makes me sad to see him, because I think, what kind of person would my dad have been if he didn't fall victim to this nightmare?
And some people outwardly mocked it, but I think a lot of other people felt sorry for them. Like losing a parent to Trump and their ideology must suck, especially if you thought they'd always be there for you and treated you with mutual respect like a parent, specifically a father, should. A lot of women think that because men have daughters and wives, that they can't be sexist, that they must love them more than they love the patriarchy. But that's not always true. Just because you have a woman in your life doesn't mean you view them as an equal, which makes those "don't you have a daughter" questions moot. Though many men do love their daughters and wives and believe in their bodily autonomy and that they can do anything a man can do, many other dads don't think that. I think what would help women better understand the men in their lives and make sense of the patriarchy is to undo the monster myth that only monsters could hurt and assault and belittle women. Undoing this thinking that monsters live among us and we must destroy them or figure out who's a monster and who's not puts blame on the victim for not figuring it out sooner, and also helps to remove culpability from the man. He would never do that. And thus the myth makes it harder to believe victims and harder to believe that any man, no matter how nice he is capable of gender-based violence. And honestly, who wants to believe that? It's a scary realization because we as straight women partner men and are attracted to men, but knowing that no man is above violence is also a good thing to keep in mind, because then you don't put anyone on a pedestal and don't start to dismiss abuse because he would never do that to me. Unlearning this myth is also beneficial to men and friends of men who might also excuse abusive behavior and sexist attitudes because he's not a stereotypical monster, he's my best friend. As one writer put it, the monster myth allows men and boys to look at their friends whom they can see all the best parts of and say he would never do that. Their friends can't be monsters because what does that mean for their own identity if they enabled such an evil person? Knowing that anyone is capable of abuse, even women, but especially men in relationships to women, is vital in being able to believe victims and to hold others accountable who may cross a line. The last way conservative men have coped with feminism is to start by saying that reverse sexism exists. Feminists don't want equal rights, they want to be the new oppressors. They're not practicing equality, they're practicing misandry. These comments came about specifically after the bear meme went viral about how women would rather have a date with a bear than a man because at least with the bear they know that they're in danger, while as with a man you never know their true intentions. Men felt as though they were being judged preemptively rather than reflecting on the fact that gender-based violence against women done by men is statistically more likely to happen than the other way around. According to Women's Aid, the National Federation for Domestic Abuse Services in England, in the year ending in March 2023, data supplied from 28 police forces showed that the victim was female in 73.5% of domestic abuse-related crimes recorded by police, compared with 26.5% of domestic abuse-related crimes where the victim was male. When it comes to the U.S., intimate partner violence tends to be most prevalent among women aged 18 to 34. An overwhelming majority of women, 77% of ages 18 to 24, 76% of ages 25 to 34, and 81% of ages 35 to 49, who are victims of intimate partner violence have suffered the same fate previously at the hands of the same partner, or the same offender, according to Louis J. Goodman, attorney at law and former Alameda County Deputy District Attorney. Women's Aid states, while both men and women may experience incidents of interpersonal violence and abuse, there are some important differences between male violence against women and female violence against men, namely the amount, severity, and impact. Women experience higher rates of repeat victimization and are much more likely to be seriously hurt or killed than male victims of domestic abuse. Further to that, women are more likely to experience higher levels of fear and more likely to be subjected to coercive and controlling behaviors. It is particularly important to understand that men do not experience domestic abuse as part of embedded structural inequalities against their sex. For women, however, domestic abuse is deeply rooted in inequalities between men and women. Other forms of inequality, such as racism, ageism, discrimination against disabled women, and women who identify as LGBTQ+, also interact with sexual inequality to affect a woman's experiences of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse perpetrated by men against women is rooted in women's unequal status in society and is part of the wider social problem of male violence against women and girls. We found in our research with the University of Bristol that sexism and misogyny set the scene for male abusive partners, coercive, and controlling behaviors. Sexism and misogyny serve to excuse abusive behavior by men in intimate relationships with women and put up barriers to female survivors being believed and supported to leave abusive men. So no, reverse sexism doesn't exist even if women are at times the perpetrator against men, as that violence is not backed by a history or legalization of men being property and barred from participating in society the same way it has been for women. And honestly, a lot of the time, I see the word misandry being thrown around by conservative men, and I roll my eyes because honestly, the more I grow old, the more I think misandry and hatred of men is a lot of the times justified. So what is misandry? Misandry, to put it simply, is prejudice against men, and it is mainly a prejudice that is held by women. But unlike misogyny that is ingrained into law and has permeated centuries of history, misandry is fairly new, at least in the mainstream, and again, not enshrined into law, but rather a discriminatory attitude against men due to patriarchy and sexism. Some men's rights activists, or MRAs, have tried to discredit feminism and women's rights with the use of misandry, trying to create a false equivalence where there is none. In their minds, women being man-haters or holding prejudice against men who systemically abuse them is the same as men taking away women's bodily autonomy, financial freedom, and who want to overturn no-fault divorce in the US. An example of their hypocrisy is that right-wing men whine about the 4B movement, also known as the 4 No's, no sex with men, no marriage to men, babies with men, and no dating men, is gender-based discrimination, while they're fine with MAGTO, or men going their own way, and being anti-dating women and anti-female. In the end, I do think that we have to be, yes, all men, because there's no such thing as a good man or a bad man under patriarchy that continually privileges men in society, in marriage, and in the traditional family. How can straight marriage ever be equal when women are expected to give up their careers to raise a family as part of the natural order of things, but men get to stay financially independent? When men can marry and have children with as many women as possible and be seen as a boss, but when a woman chooses to not have kids, is seen as a leftover woman and an old childless cat lady, where women have to be naturally mothering, but fathers can just get up and leave, and even worse at times, start whole new families with seemingly no remorse. And though I'm not sure how successful the 4B movement will be in the US or South Korea, it's something to be remarked on, and also funny to me at how much attention it's getting when MAGTO, or men going their own way, the largest incel forum at one point, is rarely ever reported on in the same way. I think what pushed me over the edge this year into misandry territory, where I do now discriminately look at cis-het men, isn't even how much they voted for Trump, but the case of Giselle Pellicot, whose husband for years drugged her and then loaned out her body to be raped by men, and who only got caught because he was upskirting women on the metro. Like, if that never happened, who knows how long he could have gone for. Not only that, but recently learning about what happened to Junko Furuta in Japan in the late 1980s, and just the more that comes out about men killing women, and how many men I know in my own life who cheated and abused their wives and kids and left, and again formed new families and just left destruction in their wake. It's just not okay. I truly believe that men and women a lot of the time weren't made to start families and be parents and be monogamous, but instead of just admitting that and not going down that traditional path, many men specifically just enter someone's life, screw it up, and leave. And I wonder why that is. And in the end, I think it's because millions of men are not okay right now. They're not okay with the changing world where women are gaining more autonomy in society and choosing not to marry and not to date. And to cope with that, instead of adapting themselves to this new world, they are vehemently railing against it to hold on to some semblance of normalcy and power, but for what? Going the traditionalist route and leaning right and living that cookie cutter life didn't work out for a lot of grown older men and women. Why would it work out for you? What do you have to gain from finding a traditional wife who you don't even like? What do you have to gain from being a father to a child you probably don't want? I just can't wrap my head around it, aside from the fact that that lifestyle is what everyone is supposed to do and people internalize that, and that's what adulting looks like. But in reality, it doesn't have to be that way. If you don't want to settle down as a man, please do not settle down with someone just because you think that's what you're supposed to do. Look inward, reflect on who you are and what you want out of life, because I think for a lot of men and for a lot of women, they don't want to give up their lives to care for a partner and kids, and that's okay. We can form a new version of the future where our lives aren't dictated by gender norms and the traditional family structure and values, and it won't mean you'll have your manhood cut off, but rather that life looks different for everyone and in this modern age, and everyone should be able to pursue what they truly want without being constrained by their assigned sex and the gender expression that's assigned to it. To conclude, I think a lot of reactionary men are conservative not only because that kind of worldview and political ideology suits them best as it keeps them privileged, but also because many of them don't know how to be outside of that framework and are afraid to find out. They're afraid to have to share a world with women and gender nonconforming people because they've had power for too long and can only fathom a world in which they become the victim and women become the oppressor. And since they know how horribly they treat and view women, thinking of a world where the roles would be reversed is terrifying. But that's not a world that feminists want to create. Feminists don't want to destroy men or discriminate against them or cut their balls off, but rather want a world where people are free to express their gender, and a world where women can move in society without judgment and without the need to protect themselves from men who, through their privileged position, are able to hurt them and get away with it. And I hope one day that world will be realized, but until then, until conservative men and conservative women for that matter stop antagonizing and fueling the fire of the gender war with sexist rhetoric to further divide us from finding common ground and seeing eye to eye, men like those who are part of MAGTOW or the MRA will face backlash and resentment from feminists, and deservedly so. So here's to the end of the gender war that keeps us divided. And remember that at the end of the day, I think women and men have a lot more in common than what is taught to us. And that though there might be a mystery to the opposite sex that we learn to believe from birth due to our separation when we're being raised, it really isn't that complicated. We can find solidarity with one another. And there are plenty of progressive and left-leaning and feminist men out there, so if you are one, thank you for that. You're the type of guy that doesn't need to hear a long caveat about not all men because you know how to take women in good faith. So that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought of it down below and what you think of the gender war in general, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.